Great. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I know there are a lot of other sessions. We appreciate you making the time to come back and listen to us. The session that we have this morning for you is about embedded analytics creating genius applications. And you can probably read that from the slide, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But the core and the crux of the presentation that we'll make this morning for you is about our embedded analytics maturity model. And that's a piece of research and thought leadership that we've developed over the course of several years, helping companies understand how deeply they need to embed their analytics into their product in order to make it a great experience for their end user and a product that they can sell for more money. So we're going to dive right in here. Chris, do you mind doing the next slide so we can introduce ourselves? So a little bit about us. I'll let Chris introduce himself first. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name is Chris Smith. Well, actually, my name isn't Chris, but I respond to that. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering, and I'm up here having a good time with Josh.
And my name is Josh Martin. I'm a Product Marketing Manager at Logi. I've been in the software space for a long time, for most of my career as an analyst, so I kind of switched sides, and now I'm on the vendor side, which has been an exciting few months for me. So today we're going to do something a little bit different than maybe some of the other sessions. We're going to do a back and forth talking about the embedded analytics maturity model and introducing it, but also giving you a demonstration of each step in the process so that you can understand not only the differences that an end user would get, but the level of effort required by developers like yourselves to introduce deeper analytics into your product. So with that, we're going to get started here. There are three key things we want you to learn today. Number one is what actually is the embedded analytics maturity model. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it so far. Hopefully by the end of this session, you'll feel very comfortable with it. But really, it's a framework for understanding analytics within your applications. The second key point is the ways to find and embrace the best model for you. Now, there are 4 levels of embedding within the embedded analytics maturity model, which is a mouthful to say. And we want you to understand when you leave this session, what is the most appropriate for your product? Maybe you don't need to come up with an infused application, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Perhaps something like Gateway or Inline is appropriate for your users. And finally, we want you to understand through the demonstrations that we're going to present to you today. So this will be interactive. If you have questions, as Chris is presenting his demonstrations, we ask that you please raise your hand, shout out. Obviously, we have a scattered group of people here, but we can certainly see you all. So if you raise your hand, we can get your attention, you can get our attention, and we'll make sure that you're heard. Chris, do you want to go to the next slide? So your challenge is that your app needs analytics or perhaps better analytics, and you maybe don't know where to start or where to end is probably the better question. So this is the market that we find ourselves in today. We understand that modern applications require analytics to be competitive, to keep users engaged, and to ultimately maintain a competitive edge over the competition. So what are embedded analytics? There are sort of 5 key areas that we'll highlight here that really define what an embedded analytics are. Number one is they integrate with your existing security. So you don't have a standalone application that requires users to re-authenticate once they try to use the analytic application itself. Also on the back end, for you, you don't have to maintain and manage multiple security systems in order to keep your customers engaged with the application. So this is simpler for your users, it's simpler for you, it's a win-win for everybody. The second piece is that it's completely white labeled. So one of the key things and a challenge for us as a company that we have is that our applications are in thousands of applications today, but unfortunately, most users don't know that they're interacting with Logi because our key criteria is that you are the brand, you know what your end users want, so we allow you to customize those applications and analytics in a way that is non-obvious to the end user, right? It looks like your brand, it feels like your brand, it feels like your application. So this is a challenge for us as a company because there are thousands of applications that people use every day and they're not familiar with us as a result of it, but it's great for you as ISVs or even vendors because it allows you to create an application that looks and feels like you own it from start to finish. The third piece is that it allows you to kick off a workflow. We'll talk more about this in a minute, and Chris will give you some great examples of what that looks like within the application itself. Number 4 is that the analytics are in line with the rest of your application, so you don't have to separate out to a new tab. You don't have to go to a standalone application, that everything is self-contained within one environment for your user. That's a key theme that you'll hear through the course of this conference is don't lose the user, right? We want to make sure that your applications are engaging and interesting to the end user, that they don't have to export the data to Excel and go do something else, making your application really just a pass-through for data. We want to make sure that your application is, from the beginning to the end, what a user will rely on to access data, analyze data, and ultimately create reporting that allows them to be successful in their role. And the last piece is that bidirectional communication with the application. Again, this is sort of on the far end of the maturity model, but the ability to communicate back and forth with the application to drive change within the application itself and for the application to drive change within the analytics is a core and critical component to ultimately embedding within the application. So here are some key stats. So why does this matter? Why are we all here? Why do we do this? For Chris and I, obviously, we think that this is important. We spend a lot of our days thinking about this, as I'm sure you do as well. But the sort of important stats are from the State of Embedded Analytics in 2016. Number one, you can see that embedded analytics are important to 94% of software companies for the reasons that we've highlighted, right? You get to keep users in your application. You get to create new lines of revenue. You get to iterate and develop your core product more effectively. Number two is that it's deeply integrated into workflows of 31% of software applications. And that means that vendors are not just taking a first cut at this and embedding analytics at a very high level. They're really thinking about how this improves the user experience. The third piece here is 75% of software companies plan to invest in analytics, making the competitive environment continuously putting pressure on everybody to innovate, iterate, and evolve. And finally, it provides 45% of the overall value of software applications. So if you're thinking about how to grow revenue in the future and you don't have analytics or you have baseline levels of analytics today, think about that in terms of growing your revenue. That 45% of the value is derived from a feature set that you could possibly charge for in the future. So those are the stats. Hopefully you guys have bought in. You're here. So I think that we don't really have to make the case too deeply for the value of embedded analytics. So why would you embed analytics? These are all things that we've sort of highlighted so far. Number one is that you get to create competitive differentiation. And this is an important aspect. I'm sure that most folks here understand it, not only if you're an ISV, but also if you're an enterprise and you want to help develop processes that your employees can use to gain competitive edge over the competition. The second is that you get to develop new and recurring revenue streams. And as we highlighted on the previous slide, 40% of the value of an application is derived from the analytics itself. Number three is that it improves stickiness and loyalty. Again, going back to that core theme of not losing the user. If you don't want users to take the data out of your application, export it to Excel or another application that then devalues your experience with them, it takes away your relationship with them, that's a key component as well. Number four is it can potentially enhance cost savings and improve efficiencies, as I mentioned before, for enterprises. And the last piece that's really valuable is that it can increase the value of hardware, create packaged offerings. So if you're a hardware manufacturer and you want to embed analytics within your, say, large machines in the manufacturing space, this is another opportunity to create a new revenue stream, competitive differentiation, and really drive some new efficiencies as well. So let's talk about the model itself, the embedded analytics maturity model. We have some funny little quotes here in between. Tomorrow's quotes are actually funnier than today's, but feel free to enjoy those while we go through it. So let's get to the next slide, which is the actual model itself. So there are 4 integration points, which not surprisingly map pretty effectively back to the 5 key areas that define what an embedded analytics model looks like. So let's do the build on the first one. So the first piece here, do we have a build on this? Yep. So the number 1 is actually not embedded. So this is something that's a standalone application, and the key features of this is basically that you have something, right? It requires that your users go into a different tab or a different application itself completely. They have to log back in through a new set of security, and it's not necessarily the best experience for an end user. It's not branded, it's not white labeled, it's not cohesive, and that's why we say it's the number 1 sort of aspect here. Number 2 is what we would consider bolt-on. So now, the big difference between step 1 and step 2 is that you're integrating with security, which is a big advantage, right? You don't necessarily, as a user, want to have to log in multiple times, and as an ISV or an enterprise, manage multiple roles and responsibilities. This is actually a big step forward, but it's still not the best experience for end users. Then we talk about things like embedding within the user interface itself. So we call that inline analytics. So now, instead of requiring that a user go to a separate application or a separate tab in order to access the analytics, it's actually in line with the rest of the application that you're giving them access to. And one of the key aspects of it being in line is that it is completely white labeled, and that's number 1. That's the most important. It looks and feels like you created it and you generated it yourself. And it ultimately represents your brand and reflects the look and the feel of what you want it to look like. So those are sort of the key aspects there. And finally, we have what we would call infused analytics. And infused analytics, if you can see there's a subtle shift, you may notice that there's an orange bar sort of separating out the analytics and inline, and infused, that orange box is actually gone. And what that means is that now it's infused within the application. It can talk to the application. There's bidirectional communication where it can change the application itself, and the application can change the analytics. Above and beyond that, it integrates with the back end in such an effective way that you can do things like kick off a workflow, and we'll give you some examples of what that looks like in just a minute. So the advantages of each area we will discuss throughout the course of the remainder of the presentation, but the key thing to really remember and understand is how far do you want to embed? How deep do you want to go? What's right for your users? We'll talk about that before we conclude today. But now I think we want to probably dive into the demos. So Chris, do you want to show everybody the next couple of slides here? We have actually one more slide before the demo, which will show you some of the key differences here. This is what we would call standalone. These are the applications we just mentioned before. So now we have a chart, and we'll build this chart throughout the remainder of this presentation that shows you some of the capabilities and features that you would get access to at each level of the maturity model. So here, the two key things for standalone is that you get interactive reports, interactive dashboards, and reports. And obviously, you'll see that as we go further along, more of those dots will be filled in. And with that, we're going to go to the demo. Now, I will warn you in advance that Chris and I have had a controversial conversation over the last few weeks. Politics, as you know, is a key topic around the country. Our office is not immune to such things. And Chris and I have had a very heated debate, which has actually boiled over to this presentation. So I will warn you in advance that if your political inclinations are sensitive, you might want to cover your ears for the rest of this presentation. So Chris, do you want to show them what you've been working on,
Well,
which has led to such controversy?
I'm really glad that you've accepted that I am going to talk about politics, and this is one of the burning topics in my community. And I really think everybody should care about this and become involved. I know I am. And it's Hens for Herndon. Now, this is a real thing. In my hometown, Herndon, Virginia, not far from here, there is a movement, Hens for Herndon, to change the laws to allow families to keep pets. And that's really the orientation, is family pets. And it's been a long fight, and it's gotten everybody in the town excited and behind this. And this website is an advocacy website to get people involved and, of course, to support the flow of donations to help the cause. So in this application, these are real news articles about our town, changing the law so that we can have hens in town. And these pictures are of my hens, and we'll get to know them as we go through. We'll look at a few of the different applications. But thinking about the models that Josh was talking about, the first one is one where I'm directed to go outside the application. And for those of you who use TurboTax, as I do, and you keep track of your donation to charities, you're familiar with having to leave TurboTax and go to a separate application where you have to log in again, keep track of all the knives and forks and used shirts and pants that you've given away, and then ultimately you can get that information back into TurboTax through a transfer of data that you have to kick off manually. In this case, of course, what's really important to us in the application is to look at cash flow. So here is our cash flow report. This is produced for the application. I can export it. I can control, which sort of periods I want to look at. And when I want to dive back into a deeper level of the analysis, my linking takes me to another application. And it normally makes me log in, but I guess I must have just logged in a minute ago. It typically will ask me to log in before I see this. And then I get to look in deeper level in the analytics. How many forks did we give away? How many shirts? And fill in all the data. So it's interactive at that point. And I've tried to tell TurboTax that should be something that is all built into the same application. And frankly, it leaves me wanting more.
Now, before we go there, Chris, I just want to sort of talk about what that experience was like for you from a building perspective. So hopefully everyone here saw that not necessarily the greatest experience for an end user. You're losing them. They're going to another application. You're managing multiple security models. Can you talk a little bit about the level of effort required to do what you just did relative to, not doing nothing. We'll get to that in the next stage about where we want to go. But how much time did it take you to stand that up? And could you possibly swing back to it for a second and show us what a dashboard within that environment would look like and how it doesn't necessarily match the rest of the user experience?
You bet. So I have my donations dashboard right here that I've been working on. I have a report, and we can dive into that dashboard and see the donations by gift category. The way we develop our donations is we offer gifts that people can purchase, and a portion of those proceeds go to support the cause. In terms of setting this up, the linkage between the two applications is trivial. And there are some advantages to that, so it's not all detractions from having to leave the application. So thinking about having one of your own applications and wanting to ultimately test the waters on allowing your customers to dive deeper, potentially to ultimately embed those analytics, the approach that we're taking here gives you a very quick path to sample what your customers like. What experiences should you set up when you ultimately embed in the application. So it allows you to test the user experiences that are compelling as you're developing your roadmap for the application to ultimately embed this in the application itself.
And it looks pretty good. I mean, it doesn't look anything like the other application, but it looks nice. You can certainly see the key information that you're looking for, so that's nice. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what the next stage would look like if we can switch back to the presentation for just a minute. And what you'll see is that when we move to the bolt-on approach, right, so we had a standalone application, and now we're going to move to bolt-on. And bolt-on, the key difference, which will be a little bit hard to see because Chris's application automatically logged him in, is that you won't have to log in. So instead of having that step where you go to the next phase and you have to remember your password and remember your username, which I'm sure we all can imagine is a huge headache for most of us, you don't have to do that anymore because you are integrated with the security of the model. So if you can go back to the slides for just, you want to go back to the slides for just a second? And we'll show you that chart that we were demonstrating just a moment ago that highlights the key differences between stage 1, which was standalone, and stage 2, which is bolt-on. So just swing right through these. So here you can see the biggest difference. There's only one really big difference. I guess I could have just illustrated it through speaking.
That makes it the biggest.
That makes it the biggest. It's 50% better. Is the integrated security component of it. Now, the stage 1 and stage 2 up to the bolt-on are things that will be easier to stand up and set up than later in the maturity model, and we don't necessarily recommend this as an end state for any customer or company because this is not good enough, it's not interesting enough, it's not compelling enough for customers to be satisfied that this is the end solution that they want to get to. So with that, we're going to show you a little bit more about what it would look like from the development perspective, and we're going to go back and forth. If you have any questions about the differences between embedding at the base level at standalone or embedding at the bolt-on level, we can talk about that, but we'll also discuss the level of effort required by Chris and for anybody else that wants to move up the maturity model to the bolt-on environment.
Sure. So before we go to our cash flow page, you know, there are a lot of examples of this that I encounter every day or at least every month when I pay bills. For example, when I go to Macy's, when I go to Home Depot and pay my bill, there's a link that takes me to a page that looks, that's already integrated. I'm already logged in, but it's obviously a different site, and there's some difficulty in navigating back and forth between the two sites. But it's a common model that you see with the big banks offering, you know, online payment facilities, and it's quite common to see that model here. So when we go to our page, this is the one, well, you saw the behavior last time. When I click on it, it allows me to go to another application. And like Macy's and Home Depot, it looks like Macy's, you know, that has kind of the same look and feel. You see kind of a different logo up here, just like I'll see, you know, the banking information or the big bank that's doing it. And I have some analytics that help me understand where I am against my targets. I've experimented with a couple of charts here because I'm the guy that gets to work on both of these applications. But really, the biggest difference is that security was already taken care of, and I was linked already. That's a facility that our platform already supports. And I've taken the time, not too much time, really, to style it so that it looks like the original application that I came from.
So can you just spend a second talking to me about the level of effort required from a security integration perspective and the advantages it would offer to an ISV or an enterprise that is interested in actually integrating security on the back end for their end users?
You bet. So for me, using Secure Key in Logi Info, it was relatively quick. It only took me about an hour to do all of the tasks that I had in mind. That was creating the linking at the security level so that I would be referred with the security token, and all of my roles and rights were communicated to the application that I landed in. The styling itself, again, was all done within that original hour, and that's because one of the features in 12.2 that I built this in has a theme editor that allows me to invoke in the browser interface that lets me, set all the aspects of the styling of the theme without having to get into the CSS and write it. It's just an interactive interface that allows you to choose the colors and the font types and different objects that'll be used in the styling of the application. So just about an hour, really.
Great. So that seems like it's worth the time to spend.
Yeah, so it's definitely worth the time, and the experience that you're providing the users feels much more seamless than the original one, where I had to log in.
Okay, can we switch back to the presentation for just a minute here? We'll show you. Now we're going to start to see some fairly substantial and major differences, not only from a technology perspective, but also from a business perspective. This is, again, a lot of this data was collected from our State of Embedded Analytics report, where we discover through talking to companies that we work with, but also many companies that we don't work with, the value that their users derive from using analytics. So if we switch here to the next chart, Chris is being nice because I spent a lot of time finding those quotes, realizing that we're only going to be on those slides for about 2 seconds. But as you can see, a lot more of these dots are filled in here. So the key ones that you probably want to look at, it has, this is now going forward, the demo that we're going to show you in just a minute. Inline has integrated UX. It appears inline, which is kind of why it's named that. We also allow you to do custom styling at this stage. Embedded self-service and discovery is something that you can start to integrate at that point if you want to. Obviously, you can do that at any stage, but if you're not willing to get this far into the process, it probably doesn't make sense to embed self-service in a standalone application. And then you start to get some business benefits from this as well, right? Number one is that you keep users in your application. They stay within the environment that you're providing them with. It starts to create some competitive differentiation. We really start to see that in the infused environment. And then you get to charge a premium, you maintain brand integrity, there's an excellent user experience. A lot of business benefits start to develop around the inline environment. Now, there's a step forward in Fuse, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but I want Chris to spend a minute or two, or possibly more, showing you what the inline experience would look like, and I think you'll see some fairly vast and substantial differences between where we were and where we're going.
Thanks. So we'll log into the application. Again, it'll look like the original application, because these are just iterative changes I've made to the application as I've made copies of it in a particular state and added some features. We'll go to our cash flow report. And now what you see is that the external view that had my KPIs has now been brought in line into the application. So it knows who I am. It knows to filter the rows for my organization, my department, my company, if I'm in a co-tenant, multi-customer environment. So all of that is handled for me within the application. And it feels native, even though it's embedded content. It allows me to, you should not be taking me back here. Let's go ahead and log back in, and it should, there we go. So it did the link, but didn't really handle the handoff of the security very well, but you could see that the linking was embedded. It was trying to take me to this page. And from a user perspective, it never really will feel like I'm leaving the application. So I had my KPIs that were in line in the report next to my cash flow report, and it allows me to navigate directly to seeing my reports, like my donations at a glance. It allows me to activate or look at other content that is all embedded here. So the self-service experience has been styled to look just like the parent application, and it provides all of the access to any of the self-service components that allow the user to ask questions that the original developers couldn't assume that I was going to ask. So we We can give our application developers KPIs. We can talk about the experience that we want for the users, but users are smart. They know their business, and the questions they ask over time changes. Providing them the means in an embedded state allows you to add value to existing applications where people already work, but allow them the freedom in a governed environment to interact with the data in ways that they haven't before, and also introduces the capability for subject matter experts, to analysts, to support people through this self-service medium the way David showed the capability to interact with the visualizations that are being published and shared.
So what would you say are the top two considerations an enterprise or a software vendor should consider when they're making the decision that they want to go inline? So what would you say are the top two things, or I wouldn't say challenges, but the top two areas that you need to focus on more specifically when you're deciding to go inline versus bolt-on?
Well, the considerations that are most important are the ones that Stephen talked about at the beginning, and that's understanding your users. Your users are employing your application to achieve results and outcomes that you're anticipating. You know what your application was built to do, and you've gained some insight by now in who are the users that are interacting with the application, the capabilities, and the capability of security to control who gets exposed to what experiences. Means that even though it's embedded, you still have the control to give various people, based on their roles and rights, the organization they're associated with, exactly the experience they want. So don't think of self-service as being on or off. Think of your users representing this entire continuum of people with different skill sets, different levels of sophistication, and maybe most importantly, different roles where they have different responsibilities in the organization to work with the data in different ways.
Now, one of the interesting things about self-service is actually, according to our current methodology around the embedded analytics maturity model, is self-service is not actually integrated into any of those steps. And one of the things that we've been talking about a lot is when you start to add self-service, does that all of a sudden create a genius application? So to be inline does not necessarily require self-service, but it could have self-service as a component. And just for the sake of time, I think we'll exclude the Harvey ball chart that we've been showing as we switch over to Infuse, because as you may have suspected, all of the dots are filled in. It's the best experience that you can offer to users, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that's something you need to do. So if you're in an environment where kicking off a workflow or integrating within the application in that way doesn't make sense necessarily, and Chris will show you some examples where it does, then you don't necessarily need to do it. So it's important to remember, as Chris has highlighted several times, what your users want, what your competition is doing, how much you want to support end users ultimately, and what you want them to be able to achieve and accomplish. So while this is the end state of our model, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be the end state for you. So let's show this, and then we'll give an example of how to actually roll out one of these projects.
Sure. So since this is the last time that you'll see the front page of this application, I thought I should probably introduce you to Pippa, one of my hens, and her eggs right there. And you have to watch these hens all the time.
Is she of age to be drinking?
In hen's years, yes. So here, I've embedded something slightly different. So the difference between inline and infused is the capability to allow your users to interact with workflows. So one of the main reasons for embedding, I think we all understand, we don't want to send users to another application or another place. And that holds true not just for the look and feel and see in the analytics, but for seeing something actionable and wanting to take action right there. So here's my cash flow report of the inflows of donations, and right next to it, instead of my KPIs, I have a table that allows me to do things like kick off the email to say thanks, to record that that thanks has been sent, and to interact in many other ways, whether it's writing back to the database saying, already done my CRM task to send the reply and took note of that, but to actually perform that function right here instead of turning to another application, whether it's email or any other application, to be able to take actions that are important and logically linked to the information that's in our applications.
So from a technical perspective, can you highlight some of the things that you had to do on the back end in Info itself to enable these capabilities, and how much time it took you, again, taking that next step from inline into infused?
Sure. So essentially, the infused application is very similar to the inline application. It's just that we're providing the means through the controls that Logi makes it easy to include, to check boxes, to launch processes that run in the background to manage those workflows. So it's very seamless in terms of difference between the two models of applications. And the difference in the level of effort wasn't very great, although it's incremental for each of the different workflows that you want to integrate. So mine was quite simple, and so was fairly trivial instead of in terms of adding additional development time to enhance workflows into the embedded content. But the individual workflows that I want to be able to support, there's no real limit to them. So think about the industry that you're creating applications for. If, for example, you're a bank and you're doing credit swaps, then probably your perspective is one of looking at the basis point differences, and you may want to use workflows that go out and capture that information and create reports that compare what your credit swaps look like compared to the sort of the current rates or the basis differences that are out there. And for every other industry, there are different important workflows. If it's manufacturing, in my application I have some embedded content, certainly one of the workflows would be to be able to communicate with the maintenance team. It's time to reset the equipment, come on out, or I've got a blockage on one of my production lines. I need specialists to come out and work on that. If it is, say, automotive parts testing, and every part that goes out goes through a battery of tests, and when things don't all test well, that piece gets put aside, I'd want to record that. I want to write it back to the database. What was the defect? What information can I supply on it? So think of all the things that you actually do as work and how those can be done in applications, and perhaps the best place to initiate that workflow is where you see the information that tells you that that workflow should be kicked off now.
Thank you. Can you go switch back to the slides?
Oh, you bet.
So we're almost done. We got about 5 minutes left. We'll go through these slides fairly quickly because we want to make sure that there's a few minutes left for questions.
Don't sound too happy about that.
Of course, be available after. So not surprisingly, here you go. Embedded self-service, again, not a key component or a required component of inline or infused. And then we're going to show you an example of how these projects generally look when we talk to our customers. So if you can scroll through the next couple of slides. Preparing for embedding.
Oh, sorry,
so
I missed
the number one thing, sorry, go ahead. You can just build this whole slide here. You need to assess the market, right? And this is a key point of what we've been discussing throughout this presentation. Are your customers asking for analytics? Now, you folks are here, so I'm assuming the answer to that question is yes. The second question is, are your competitors offering analytics? Is this a requirement in order to remain competitive? Is it an opportunity for you to jump ahead of the competition? Number three is, will your customers pay more, or does this give you an opportunity to grow your total addressable market? And there you go, I went ahead of myself there. And number five is, how ready are you today to support an analytics initiative? Because if you're going to invest in analytics, you want to make sure that you're doing it right. You want to make sure you set up the proper project plan, you understand your customer needs, you understand the competitive environment, basically the questions that we've highlighted here. So we have just two more quick slides here. Number one is really you want to establish a project plan and a phase. Phase one is about performance, and then phase two is about the user experience. So think about your data. You want to think about the architectural improvements. How do you do performance testing? And then phase two is really about the implementation. How do you make it look and feel like the rest of your application? And then this is just a sample, right? So this would be setting up that project plan and how long you want to do it for, and depending on the capabilities, obviously this could be compressed fairly significantly. We just wanted to build out this slide a little bit. But design and planning, data warehousing. So really thinking about the plumbing that is required to develop this application, and then ultimately, how do you make it look and feel and interact in a way that your customers will care about? With that, we have committing to delivery. So you set up your plan, you make a strategy, and then ultimately you have to deploy to the marketplace. And we have some sessions tomorrow that will deal with how do you actually monetize these applications once you've embedded analytics within them. And then we have some final conclusions for you to walk away from this with. So number one is that your app needs modern analytics. I think this is probably an easy one to sell to everybody in the room. Number two is that you plan to get analytics right the first time, and that sometimes requires some timing and some planning, but you don't want to roll something out that's not ready for your customers. Number three is prioritize the features your users most demand. And this is, again, looping back to earlier in the presentation where understanding customer needs is really important because you don't want to invest a lot of time, perhaps integrating with a very extensive workflow if your customers aren't going to ultimately wind up using it. You'll delay your launch and you'll wind up spending and burning a lot of cycles on something that ultimately is non-monetizable. And finally, you want to integrate self-service to avoid the success problem. The success problem is, as we define internally, you have such great analytics that everyone says, these are great, but I want my chart to look a little different, or I want a bar chart instead of a pie chart, or whatever thousands of different requests or variations on the two themes that I just highlighted are. Self-service, as we've highlighted in the 12.2 launch, gives users the ability to, at a baseline level, start to make some of those changes themselves. They can make it look the way they want. They can make it feel the way that they want. They can change the data in a way that's meaningful to them. So with these sort of key conclusions, I think we're going to wrap it up. We'll be here for questions. We can take some from the audience. We have about a minute or two left. But I hope this session was useful for you in understanding the levels of embedding that are available to you as customers of Logi and giving you some baseline understanding of where you want to go and where you need to be. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Any questions? Okay, we didn't, oh, okay, right up here. Want to just repeat the question also?
Sure. So the question is, as new versions of the application come out and you've created, I presume, definition modifier files to rework the... Okay. So I gave a hint to what my answer will be. So the question was, do we have to do all of that process over again? And in most cases, no. In some cases, it depends on the methodology you've used. So for example, Logi creates a lot of the experience through pre-built elements. And in 12.2, there are new features that are based on distributed authorship. So the ability for people through the browser to define data connections, new metadata for views, theme editing, and so forth. So since those didn't exist in the prior applications, if you need to account for those in your styling, that'll mean a few additional steps to change those as well. One of the methodologies that I recommend is using the definition modifier file, and that way I don't end up reworking a lot of the HTML itself, but I essentially look up the definition modifier file will just require a couple of additions to handle those new controls that are in the page instead of reworking the whole page.
I think with that, we are actually out of time. I want to make sure that we get everybody the opportunity to go and get another cup of coffee and get some of the buttons that you need. We have one more question in the back of the room. If you want to come up, we're more than happy to stay here for a few more minutes. But in respect of your time and getting to the next stage here, we want to make sure that we let you go. So again, thank you for the time. If you have any follow-up questions, Chris or I will be happy to answer them. If they're technical, please direct them to Chris, because that's what I will tell you to do.
Sure. I'll be happy to show you the studio definitions, et cetera, if you'd like to see them. Thanks a lot.